was not in the middle of the night that I first noticed her, but rather in the stillness of the early hours when the world seems to hold its breath. The air in the room was heavy with the weight of something unsaid, something creeping, just beyond the threshold of my understanding. I awoke to find the shadows stretching unnaturally across the walls, contorting into forms that seemed deliberate. Yet I was not afraid, or at least not at first. There was something strange about my room, but in the half-dreamy haze that lingered in the dark, it was almost as if I had been expecting it. My eyes fell upon the corner of my room where, nestled among the half-empty bookshelves, there sat a small porcelain doll. It had not been there before. I knew it, for I was certain that no such object existed in my home. She was a little thing, with porcelain skin that seemed to shimmer in the dim light of my lamp. A blank stare fixed upon me with a disconcerting stillness, and as I looked closer, I could not discern where her eyes ended and the darkness began. There was a strange feeling that washed over me, something cold, like a distant whisper that I could not quite hear. I thought it was simply my mind playing tricks on me, but the longer I stared, the more I felt watched. Suddenly, my pulse quickened. I couldn't explain it, but I had the unmistakable sensation that the doll had moved closer. The hairs on my neck rose and an inexplicable fear gripped my chest. I turned away, convincing myself it was my imagination, but as I closed my eyes to sleep again, I felt it, her gaze, unblinking, undisturbed. The thought that she was alive, a being of some sort, made my skin crawl. Morning came, and the sun's pale light seemed to chase away the chill of the night, but I couldn't shake the unease. The doll was still there, sitting innocuously in the corner, as if nothing had happened. I brushed it off as a product of a restless sleep, but deep down I couldn't escape the sinking feeling that something had begun, something I could not understand. But as I got out of bed, I noticed a subtle shift, a difference in the doll's position. She was closer now, just a little bit. The thought struck me like a bolt. How could that be? I dared not investigate further, but I could not ignore it. The feeling of being watched followed me throughout the day, a gnawing presence that lingered just beyond the edge of my perception. As night fell and the shadows returned, I could not bring myself to sleep. There was something about the doll's stillness that had become oppressive, as if it were waiting for me to succumb to its pull. It was then that I heard it. A soft, deliberate sound, faint but unmistakable, rising from the corner of the room. It was the sound of porcelain shifting, slowly, unnaturally, with deliberate intent. I dared not look, but I did. And there she was, sitting even closer now, staring up at me with those blank, hollow eyes, as if she had been waiting for me all this time. I could feel the air grow cold, the silence pressing down upon me. The room seemed to close in as if the walls themselves were aware of her presence. I could hear the doll's eyes, their gaze piercing through the darkness, their intent unreadable yet unmistakable. Something was coming, something I could not escape. And as I backed away, something whispered from the shadows, "You will find me again tonight." The night returned, and with it an oppressive silence that gnawed at my senses. The oppressive darkness, thick like a fog, seemed to settle in the corners of my room. I had hoped foolishly that perhaps I had imagined the events of the night before, my mind, exhausted from the torments of sleep, playing tricks on me. But as I lay there wide awake, the undeniable truth crept upon me once more. I was not alone. The doll had returned, as if summoned by some force that lay beyond my comprehension. I dared not look at her directly at first, for the simple thought of her proximity was enough to send a chill racing through my veins. But despite my best efforts to remain calm, my eyes betrayed me. They sought her out. There she was, sitting upon the floor once again, eyes wide, staring at me with an intensity I could not shake. But something was different. She was not exactly in the same place as before. She had shifted, moved imperceptibly closer, a few inches perhaps, but enough to fill me with dread. I tried to convince myself it was the shifting shadows playing tricks, but the tightness in my chest would not allow me to indulge such a thought. Something was wrong. Something was terribly wrong. I turned my gaze to the rest of the room, my breath shallow as my mind reeled from the strangeness of it all. It wasn't just the doll. No, it was more than that. The air around me was thick, heavier than before, pressing against my chest, as though it were alive. The silence seemed to hum with a quiet malevolence and energy that I could not name but could certainly feel. As I turned away, desperately trying to escape the growing unease, I heard it, a whisper, faint yet clear, like a breath on my ear. It was a name. My name. I froze. The voice, soft, like a lover's caress, yet chilling in its familiarity, came from the very corner of the room. I couldn't understand the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It was as though it was beckoning me, urging me to listen, to follow. My heart pounded in my chest, and yet I found myself drawn to the sound. Unable to resist, I stood up, my legs trembling beneath me, my feet moving on their own accord toward the doll. My mind screamed at me to turn back, but something, the force of the voice perhaps, pushed me onward. I reached the corner where the doll had been, and there, I saw her, once again, closer than ever before. Her blank, lifeless eyes seemed to gleam in the dim light. But there was something more now, something that sent an icy spike of terror into my spine. She was not alone. Behind her, against the shadowed wall, a figure stood. A figure cloaked in darkness, its form indistinguishable from the night itself. It was tall, impossibly tall, its presence immense. And though I could not make out its features, I could feel its gaze piercing into my soul, as if it knew me, knew everything about me. My heart skipped a beat. The whispering voice echoed again, this time in my mind, as if it had taken root there, like a shadow that would not leave. I tried to turn, but the air was thick, suffocating, and the floor beneath me seemed to twist as though it were made of liquid. I stumbled, my hands reaching for something, anything to hold on to, but there was nothing. Only the presence. Only the doll. The figure stepped forward, its form beginning to take shape, becoming more tangible, more real with every step it took. My legs gave out beneath me and I fell, unable to move, unable to scream. My breath came in short gasps as I lay paralyzed on the floor, staring at the doll, who was now inches from my face. The voice filled my mind once again, now clearer than ever. You will find me again. Tonight. And then, in that instant, the room was plunged into absolute darkness. The voice whispered once more, its cold fingers tracing the edges of my mind. You are mine now. I awoke with a start, my breath ragged and my heart pounding against my chest. The oppressive silence of the night had been replaced by an eerie stillness, a palpable weight that seemed to hang in the very air around me. It took me a moment to orient myself, to remind myself that I was still in my room, still within the confines of my own bed. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The darkness felt different now, more suffocating, more alive. I had been dreaming again. I had walked through that endless labyrinth, the walls closing in around me, the doll always one step ahead, guiding me further into the unknown. But it wasn't just the dream that haunted me, it was the feeling of the dream bleeding into my waking life. The whispering voice, the presence behind me, and that unholy proximity of the doll. It was no longer a matter of waking up, of escaping. The line between reality and nightmare had been shattered, and I could feel it deep in my bones. I was trapped, and every time I closed my eyes, I was drawn deeper into the labyrinth I could not escape. In my desperation, I sought answers. The air in my room had begun to thicken with a sense of inevitability, and I knew that to understand the nature of the doll, its power, its hold over me, I had to know more. It was not enough to simply fear it. I needed to know why it had chosen me. I spent hours searching, flipping through books, rifling through old family heirlooms in an attempt to uncover any clue that might explain the curse that had been placed upon me. But it wasn't until I found the old journal in the attic, buried beneath forgotten boxes of long unused trinkets, that I began to uncover the truth. The journal belonged to someone else. A child who had lived in this very house many years ago, someone whose name had been long since erased from the records. Her words were hurried, frantic, written in ink that had long since faded, but they were clear enough to understand. She spoke of a doll, the same doll, a porcelain figure with eyes that seemed to watch the owner, that never left them, not even when they were awake. The journal detailed strange occurrences, whispers in the night, shadows moving where they shouldn't, and an insistent presence that could not be shaken. The child had been drawn into a labyrinth of dreams, much like I had, and in her final frantic entries, she begged for someone to destroy the doll before it consumed them completely. "She comes closer every night," one of the last entries read. "She is a gate to something dark. Do not let her take you. She takes the soul and binds it to the maze forever." It became painfully clear to me now. The doll was not just an object. It was a portal, a bridge between worlds, the waking world and the nightmare realm where I was slowly becoming trapped. The labyrinth was not just a dream, it was real, and with every passing night, it was pulling me deeper. I thought of destroying the doll, of ending it once and for all, but fear stopped me. The journal had made it clear. To destroy the doll was to be consumed by the very thing I feared most. It was the only way out. But the price would be my soul. As I sat there, holding the journal, the lights in the room flickered. My heart skipped a beat as I heard it, the whisper, the same voice that had haunted me in my dreams now echoing through the room. "You cannot run," it said, soft and insistent, like the murmur of a lover's voice. "You cannot escape." I dropped the journal in a panic, my hands shaking. I turned to face the corner of the room, my eyes falling on the doll. There she was, and she was closer than ever. I could no longer tell where the dream ended and reality began. As I stumbled backward, the floor beneath me shifted, and the walls of the room seemed to close in. My vision blurred, and I felt the pull of the labyrinth once more. The doll's gaze burned into me, and the whisper grew louder. "You will stay with me forever." I could feel her eyes on me, watching me with an intensity that seemed to pierce my very soul. The room had become a prison, a mere shadow of the place I had once known. The doll, her porcelain skin, her cold, lifeless stare, was now far too close, inches from where I stood. Her gaze was unyielding, her presence undeniable, and in that moment I felt her power grip me like an iron vice. I had tried to convince myself that I could still escape, still wake from this nightmare. But as the nights wore on, as each evening bled seamlessly into the next, I realized with growing horror that I had no control. It was no longer a matter of sleep, it was a matter of existence. The labyrinth I had entered, the one that had once been confined to the dream world, was encroaching upon my waking life. Each step I took, each breath I drew, seemed to pull me deeper into its grasp. And the doll, she was the gateway. She was both the key and the prison, a presence that existed at the boundary of reality and nightmare. I could no longer sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I found myself back in that dark, twisting maze. The walls stretched endlessly in all directions, and no matter which way I turned, I felt the weight of the darkness closing in. It was suffocating. And the doll, she was always there, watching, waiting for me to make my next move. Her cold, unblinking eyes were like a lure, drawing me further and further into the maze that I could not escape. I began to wonder if I was losing my mind. Was it possible for the mind to twist so completely that even waking life became indistinguishable from a dream? Or was I truly trapped? Was I doomed to wander in this endless labyrinth forever? I decided, in my desperation, to confront the doll. I had to do something. I could not simply let this thing consume me. As I approached her, the air around me grew cold, and the shadows seemed to lengthen, stretching unnaturally towards me. I reached out, my trembling fingers brushing against the porcelain of the doll. In that instant, the room seemed to dissolve around me. I was no longer in my room. I was in the labyrinth again, but this time it was different. The walls were closer, the air thicker, and the oppressive darkness felt alive as if it were breathing, pulsating with a life of its own. The doll was there waiting for me, standing at the center of the maze. Her eyes glowed with an eerie, unsettling light, and I could feel her presence in every corner of the labyrinth, following my every move. "You cannot escape," the voice whispered, again, this time louder, more insistent. "You will wander here forever." I turned to run, but the walls shifted, closing in on me, hemming me in. The ground beneath my feet seemed to shift and undulate, as if the maze itself were alive, shifting, changing with every step I took. I had no sense of direction, no sense of time. All I knew was that the maze was closing in and I was running out of air. I couldn't breathe, I couldn't think. My chest felt tight, as if the very walls of the labyrinth were squeezing the life out of me. Then I saw it, a doorway, faintly illuminated by an ethereal glow. It was small, almost insignificant, but I knew it was my only chance. I ran toward, hit my feet stumbling beneath me, the walls pressing in closer and closer. The whispering voice followed me, its words now frantic, desperate. "You will never leave," it hissed. "You are mine." I reached the doorway, but just as I was about to step through, the floor beneath me gave way. I screamed, but my voice was swallowed by the darkness. I fell, the air rushing past me in a blur, and the world around me twisted and distorted. When I finally hit the ground, I was no longer in the maze. I was back in my room. Or at least I thought I was. The walls were the same, but they felt wrong. The air was heavy with a presence I couldn't shake, a presence that pressed in from all sides. And there, standing in the corner of the room, was the doll. And this time she was not alone. There was something else with her, something lurking in the shadows. It was the same figure, the one I had glimpsed before, tall and imposing. Its form, shrouded in darkness. It stepped forward, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. I was no longer sure of where I was. The labyrinth had followed me here. "You have entered my world now," the figure said, its voice low and guttural. "And there is no escape." The walls of my room seemed to pulse, as though they were alive, breathing in time with the rising panic in my chest. I had no time to think, no time to process. The presence in the room, dark, malevolent, impossibly cold, pressed down on me with a weight that felt as if it were crushing my very soul. The doll was standing there, but she was no longer just an inanimate object. She was a harbinger, a vessel for something far darker than I could comprehend. And the figure in the shadows, it was moving closer, its steps silent yet powerful, as though the very space around it bent to its will. The coldness in the room deepened, suffocating me, and I could feel my skin prickle with a mixture of dread and cold sweat. My breath came in shallow, erratic gasps as I backed away from the doll. I had no escape. No matter how much I tried to rationalize, to convince myself that there was some way out of this madness, I knew the truth deep down. I was trapped in this nightmare, in this endless cycle of torment that I could neither wake from nor escape. The figure stepped into the light, its form now clear in the dim glow that filled the room. It was tall, impossibly tall, and its eyes, oh God, its eyes were black as pits, endless voids that seemed to devour everything they looked upon. The doll, too, had changed. Her eyes, once empty and lifeless, were now gleaming with a malevolent light, and her porcelain skin seemed to crack and shift as though she were made of something far darker than any earthly material. "You cannot run," the voice whispered again, this time louder, more forceful, its words like tendrils wrapping around my mind. "You are mine now." I tried to scream, but my voice was gone. My throat constricted, suffocating me with each breath. My legs were frozen, unable to move, my body betraying me as the figure drew closer. The doll's smile, a twisted, grotesque thing, grew wider, its eyes gleaming with satisfaction. It felt as though the very air around me was thick with dread, every inch of space alive with a pulsating energy that dragged me deeper into the nightmare. I had to do something. I had to escape. But the question lingered. How? Desperation clawed at me as I stumbled backward, my mind racing for any possible solution, anything that could free me from this hellish grip. And then, in the corner of my mind, a thought flickered. A memory. The journal. The child's journal. Her desperate cries for help. Her warnings. It was the key, the only thing that could save me. I could still hear the voice of the child, the words echoing through my mind. Do not destroy the doll. If you do, she will take you forever. But what else could I do? I had to destroy her. I had to break the cycle. The labyrinth would consume me if I didn't. I looked back at the doll, and in that moment, I realized something terrible. She wasn't just a vessel. She was the labyrinth itself. She was the gate and the keeper. And the only way to truly escape was to face her head on. The room seemed to warp around me, the shadows stretching longer and darker, pulling me in. The figure in the corner reached out, its long, gnarled fingers brushing against my skin, sending an electric shock of terror through my body. My breath caught in my throat, and my heart raced as I turned back to the doll. Her eyes locked with mine, and I could see it now. The trap. I was never meant to escape. You belong to me. The voice whispered one final time. You are mine to keep forever. I took a step forward, my hands shaking as I reached for the doll. But as my fingers grazed her porcelain skin, the world seemed to dissolve once more. The walls, the room, the figure, they all vanished in an instant, and I was once again standing at the entrance to the labyrinth. But this time, something was different. The maze was no longer a mere dream. It was real. The walls rose before me, their edges jagged and sharp, and the air was thick with a suffocating, oppressive silence. The doll stood at the center of the maze, watching me with those unblinking eyes, as the figure loomed behind her. Welcome home, the voice said, its tone gleeful as if it had been waiting for this moment. You will never leave. As I stepped forward, the labyrinth shifted, its walls closing in around me. The voice laughed, a low, guttural sound that filled the maze. And as the darkness closed in, I realized the horrifying truth. There was no way out. I stood at the entrance of the labyrinth, my heart pounding in my chest. The walls of the maze loomed before me, taller and darker than ever, as if they were mocking me, daring me to take a step inside. The doll was still there, motionless at the center, her eyes gleaming with that unnatural, otherworldly light that had haunted me since the very beginning. The figure, it, was just behind her, waiting, watching, its presence as suffocating as ever. I could feel the weight of their eyes on me, both of them, the doll and the figure, silently urging me to enter, to surrender to the inevitable. But something inside me, some small spark of resistance, refused to let go. I had been trapped for what felt like eternity, wandering this nightmare with no end in sight. The maze had become my world, its walls closing in with every passing second. The air was thick, heavy with dread, and every breath felt like it could be my last. But I knew in that moment that there was a choice I had to make. The labyrinth, the doll, the figure, they were all part of this hellish cycle. And the only way to break free was to face it, to confront the very thing that had bound me to this place. I couldn't keep running. I couldn't keep hiding from the truth. And yet a voice inside my head, soft, faint, but insistent, warned me of the danger. Don't destroy the doll. Don't fall into their trap. It was the voice of the child, the one who had written the journal, the one who had suffered before me. I could still hear her cries, her desperate pleas for me to listen, to understand. But the thought of being trapped here forever, of wandering this maze for all eternity, was too much to bear. I couldn't let this happen. Not again. I couldn't lose myself to the darkness. With shaking hands, I stepped forward. As soon as my foot crossed the threshold, the world shifted. The walls of the labyrinth seemed to bend, contorting around me as though they were alive, as though the very space itself was reacting to my presence. The darkness grew deeper, colder, and I could feel the oppressive weight of it pressing in on me, suffocating me with its unbearable presence. And the doll, she was still there, standing at the center, watching. I could feel her gaze searing into my soul as if she were waiting for me to make the final move. "You will never leave," the voice whispered low and hollow, as it had so many times before. But now it felt different. There was a finality to it, a sense of inevitability that chilled me to my very core. I turned frantic, my heart racing, desperate for any way out. But the maze was closing in, the walls shifting and narrowing with each passing second. There was no escape, no way out. I could hear footsteps behind me, slow, deliberate, the sound of something or someone approaching. It was the figure, I was certain of it. The footsteps were getting louder, closer, as if it were closing in on me, ready to claim me as its own. I had to do something. I had to stop it. But what could I do? I reached out, my hand trembling, and touched the doll. The moment my fingers made contact, the world seemed to explode. The walls of the labyrinth shattered like glass, breaking apart in a deafening crash. The darkness that had once enveloped me was suddenly gone, replaced by a blinding light that filled every inch of the space. I could feel the ground shift beneath my feet, and for a moment, I was weightless, suspended in a void between worlds. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. I was standing in my room again, or at least I thought I was. The walls were the same. The air felt familiar, but there was something wrong. The shadows were deeper than before, stretching out in unnatural angles, and the silence was too quiet, as if the world had stopped breathing. I turned, and there, standing in the corner, was the doll. Her eyes gleamed with that same malevolent light, and her smile, a twisted, cruel thing, grew wider as she took a step toward me. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But my legs were paralyzed, my body frozen in place as if some unseen force was holding me captive. "You are mine," the doll whispered, her voice soft, but filled with an unmistakable sense of finality. "You always have been." And in that moment, I realized the truth. The labyrinth had never been a place. It had always been a state of mind. It was me. I had become the labyrinth. I had fallen into the very trap I had been trying to escape from all along. The maze wasn't a place I could run from, it was within me. And there in the center of my own mind I saw her, the doll, waiting. "Now you will never leave," the doll whispered again, her voice like a final breath as the walls of the labyrinth closed in around me. Forever. The labyrinth had never been a place I could escape from. It had always been a part of me. I had been running in circles, desperately seeking a way out. But the truth was more terrifying than any of the twisted paths I had walked. I was the maze. I was the prisoner and the warden, bound forever to the dark corridors of my own mind. The doll, with her cold, lifeless eyes, had been the key to unlocking the endless loop of fear and madness that I had willingly stepped into. There was no escaping it. No waking up, no light at the end of the tunnel. I stood in the center of my own mind, surrounded by the endless maze of my thoughts. The doll was still there, her smile widening, her eyes glinting with a knowing, terrible satisfaction. She was the keeper of this nightmare, the ruler of this unending prison, and I had become her prisoner. I could feel the walls closing in again, the darkness creeping around the edges of my consciousness, threatening to swallow me whole. But there was no need to fight anymore. The fight had been lost the moment I had touched her, the moment I had entered the labyrinth. "You are mine now," she whispered one final time, her voice as cold as the grave. "And you will never leave." I could feel the pull of the darkness, drawing me deeper, pulling me into the abyss, and I knew without a doubt that I would never wake up. The maze would never end. It was eternal. And as I succumbed to the darkness, the last thought that crossed my mind was a single haunting question. What if I had been the dream all along? If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, comment, and share it with your friends. Join the conversation. What do you think of the ending? Did the maze truly consume her, or is there a way out? Let me know your thoughts and stay tuned for more tales that will keep you awake at night. The room was unnervingly silent. Eliza had never been one to believe in the supernatural, yet tonight something seemed off. The air was dense, almost oppressive, as though it was alive, watching her every movement. It began with a gift. A small, antique doll that had appeared on her doorstep with a note that read, "For you, my dear, be careful what you wish for." At first it seemed like a strange, harmless gesture, an oddity perhaps, but nothing more. But Eliza could not ignore the peculiar thing about the doll. It moved. It was subtle at first, a shift in its position when she wasn't looking, a slight turn of its head when she'd step out of the room. Eliza dismissed it as the product of her overactive imagination. That is, until she saw it with her own eyes. One night, as she stood in front of the full-length mirror, brushing her hair, she caught a glimpse of the doll's reflection. The doll was facing her in the mirror, but Eliza was sure it hadn't been moved. Her heart skipped a beat. Her gaze darted between the doll and the reflection. There it was again, a subtle twitch, a small movement in the mirror. The doll's tiny porcelain hands began to tremble, though Eliza knew no one had touched it. She stepped back, her breath catching in her throat. What was happening? And then, it whispered. A voice, soft and eerily familiar, seemed to come from the reflection. "You shouldn't have looked." Eliza froze. As she turned to face the doll, it was gone, and in its place was a single note, scribbled in hasty handwriting. "Do not trust the mirror." Eliza could hardly sleep that night. The chill from the mirror seemed to follow her, lingering in the air like a cold breath on her neck. The following morning, she decided to investigate the strange happenings. The doll had vanished, but its note remained, a silent reminder of the horrors she had dismissed. But now the mirror seemed different. It called to her. Drawn inexplicably toward it, Eliza studied her reflection. It was the same, yet not. Her movements were sluggish, as though something was slightly out of sync, as if her reflection was a moment behind. And then it grinned. Eliza staggered back, her chest tight with terror. The smile in the mirror was not hers. It was cold, malicious. The reflection seemed to mock her. She reached out to touch the glass, half hoping to confirm it was just her imagination. But the moment her fingers brushed the surface, she felt a pull, a slight tug, just enough to make her pulse race. The reflection's smile widened. She pulled her hand back, heart pounding in her ears. "No," she whispered. "I'm just imagining things." But she wasn't. The reflection blinked. A shadow shifted in the corner of the mirror, just out of her line of sight. And Eliza realized with horror that the reflection was no longer mimicking her movements. The next few days were a blur. Eliza avoided the mirror, but it was always there, a dark presence lurking at the edge of her vision. She felt its weight, its cold stare, even when she wasn't looking directly at it. Her friends noticed her unease. "Eliza, you're looking pale," one of them commented. "You need to take a break." But there was no escape. No matter where she went, the mirror seemed to haunt her. One evening, desperate for answers, she decided to do something she'd never thought she'd consider. She would destroy the mirror. If she couldn't escape its influence, she'd simply remove it. With trembling hands, she picked up a hammer, but just as the first strike was about to shatter the glass, she hesitated. A voice, cold and insistent, stopped her. "Do not break the mirror, Eliza." It was the reflection, but it wasn't hers. She turned to find the source, but the room was empty. The voice, however, lingered in her mind like an echo. The The reflection, they were calling her. A deep fear rose in her chest. What had she done to deserve this curse? Eliza dropped the hammer in shock as her reflection smiled once more. This time it reached out of the mirror. Eliza was no longer sure what was real. Her reflection, once a mere imitation of her, had become something more, something alive. She could no longer look into the mirror without seeing it move independently, without feeling the cold presence watching her every moment. She couldn't escape. The mirror demanded her attention, and every time she tried to ignore it, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. One night she woke to the sound of footsteps. At first she thought it was just the house settling, but then she heard it again, a soft tap, 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 as though someone was knocking on the other side of the mirror. "Eliza," the voice came again. It was closer now, like a breath on her neck. "Come closer." Her heart raced as she approached the mirror, hands shaking. She didn't want to, but she had to. It was as though the mirror had wrapped itself around her mind, pulling her in like a spider to its web. And then, just as her face was inches from the glass, she saw it. A shadow, dark and oppressive, began to swirl beneath the surface. The reflection no longer matched her movements. It was alive. Eliza reached out to touch the surface again, and the reflection reached back, grabbing her. Eliza struggled, her fingers digging into the glass as if she could somehow tear herself free. But the reflection, the thing behind the mirror, had her. Its grip was unyielding, cold as ice, pulling her deeper into its grasp. She tried to scream, but the sound was swallowed by the glass. She was no longer in her room. She was inside the reflection, in a world that mirrored hers, yet twisted and wrong. Her reflection stood before her, smiling with those cold, dead eyes. The smile stretched impossibly wide. "You should have listened, Eliza." Terror gripped her heart as she realized what had happened. The reflection wasn't just trying to trap her. It wanted to take her place in the real world. She had been wrong all along. The doll, the note, the whispers, they had been a warning. Her body trembled, but she fought back. She had to escape. She had to survive. The reflection stepped closer, and then it reached into her chest, pulling at something invisible, something that wasn't part of her. Eliza could feel the mirror pulling her apart. The world she had known, the world of warmth and light, was slipping away as the reflection wrapped itself around her, consuming her essence. She was no longer sure which world was real, but then, in a desperate moment, she remembered the hammer, the tool she had rejected, the one that could break the curse. With all the strength she could muster, Eliza broke free, pushing herself away from the reflection. The glass cracked, the world shattering, and Eliza fell back into her room. She was free, or so she thought. As she lay there, gasping for breath, Eliza glanced at the shattered mirror pieces scattered across the floor, and in one of them she saw it, her reflection smiling back at her. And it wasn't her. The smile widened, and for the first time, Eliza realized the horrifying truth. The reflection had never let her go. Eliza stared at the shattered pieces of glass scattered across the floor, each reflecting her face, distorted, torn between worlds. She had broken, free, or so she thought. But then, as her breathing steadied, a chill settled in the air. The pieces of the mirror seemed to shift, and through one of the shards, she saw it, the reflection, smiling back at her. But it wasn't her smile. It was something darker, something waiting. In the moment before she could react, the reflection reached out from the glass, and this time, it wasn't just watching. Eliza's heart raced. She had escaped, only to realize she was still trapped in its game. Is the reflection still waiting for you too? Never trust the mirrors. The storm raged outside, but within the confines of the dimly lit room, Victor was alone, his eyes fixated on the dolls that lined the shelves. The strange collection had started as a fascination, but it had since consumed him entirely. He had found them in an old antiques shop, relics of a forgotten time, each doll more exquisite than the last. With delicate porcelain faces and hair that shimmered like silk, they seemed to speak to him, quiet whispers from the past. But there was one that stood apart from the rest, a doll with hair so strikingly similar to that of a missing girl, Emma Lane, whose disappearance had gripped the town years ago. Her case had gone cold with no leads, no suspects, and no answers. But now, with the doll before him, Victor could feel a chill creeping into his veins. The eyes of the doll seemed to watch him unblinking as though waiting for something. He reached out to touch the porcelain face, but just as his fingers brushed against it, a voice whispered, faint but clear, "Victor." He froze. The voice was unmistakable. It was Emma's. Victor could hardly believe what had just happened. His heart pounded in his chest, and yet he couldn't tear his eyes away from the doll. He stepped back, running a shaky hand through his hair. He needed to calm himself. It must have been a trick of the wind, a sound carried by the storm. But when he looked down, his blood ran cold. The doll had moved, just slightly. Its head turned to face him. In a panic, Victor pulled up his laptop. His fingers trembled as he typed, "Emma Lane missing." The search results hit him like a blow to the stomach. The missing girl had vanished without a trace, but the most unsettling part of the search results was the photo. The doll's hair. It was exactly the same as Emma's. Victor stumbled back from the screen, his head spinning. This was no coincidence. He had to know more. He grabbed the doll, holding it up to the light. It was made from real human hair. A soft whisper, almost imperceptible, came from the doll's lips. "Find me." Victor's pulse raced. The room seemed to close in on him as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. He had never believed in the supernatural, never considered that something so impossible could be real. But the doll's hair, its eyes, the whispers, it all pointed to something far darker than he could have ever imagined. His thoughts raced. He needed to end this madness. He couldn't allow himself to become ensnared by whatever curse had been placed on these dolls. He threw the doll down onto the floor and stared at it, hoping it would stay still. But then, just like before, it started to move, its tiny porcelain hands scraping across the floor toward him. Victor's stomach churned as he stumbled backward, his eyes locking onto the shelves of dolls. He could see them now, clearly. They were all different, but they shared one disturbing trait. They all had hair made from real children's locks, hair that matched the descriptions of missing children from around the area. A cold, icy dread seeped into his bones. The dolls weren't just dolls, they were vessels for something far darker. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from the hallway, followed by a soft voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You're next." His breath caught in his throat as he turned toward the door. Standing in the doorway was another doll, its eyes wide open, unblinking. Victor's mind was spinning. He had to get out. The house felt suffocating, as though the very walls were closing in on him. His heart raced, but his legs moved like lead, as if something invisible was pulling him deeper into the house. He ran upstairs to the attic, desperate to find answers. There had to be a reason for all of this. There had to be a way to stop it. He grabbed the old chest in the corner of the attic, rummaging through the dust-covered belongings inside. Finally, he found something, a journal, yellowed with age and stained with time. The writing inside was erratic, the ink smeared in places, but one phrase jumped out at him, causing his blood to freeze. The final piece must be taken, the sacrifices required. Victor's stomach churned. The journal described the process of creating the dolls, not as innocent toys, but as vessels for lost souls, bound to their hair and their bodies. And there, at the bottom of the page, was a name. The Collector. Victor could feel a weight pressing down on him, suffocating him. He was trapped in a curse, the same curse that had claimed Emma and the others, and now the final sacrifice was waiting. From behind him, he heard a soft giggle. The dolls were moving. They were closer now, closing in on him. Victor's heart pounded in his chest as he turned around to face the dolls. They were no longer merely dolls. They had become something else. Their movements were no longer slow or stiff. Now they moved with purpose, as if they had minds of their own. Victor's mind raced. He had to finish this. He had to break the curse, destroy the dolls before they took everything from him. He tried to run, but his feet felt as if they were stuck in place. He could hear the whispers, now a chorus of voices, all chanting the same words. The last piece. The last piece. He turned and sprinted toward the door, but the house seemed to stretch, to warp before his eyes. The walls closed in on him, the floor beneath him sinking like quicksand. He couldn't escape. And then, as his eyes fell on the final doll, the one with Emma's hair, he realized the truth. He was the last piece. Victor collapsed to his knees, his body trembling in horror. The dolls advanced, their small hands reaching for him. He fought, but it was useless. He could already feel them pulling at him, tearing him apart. With one final scream, Victor disappeared into the abyss, his body becoming a part of the collection forever. The last piece had been claimed. Victor was no more. The dolls, now complete, stood in their final formation. Their porcelain faces were flawless, their eyes locked in eternal stillness. But there was a new doll among them, one made of human skin. Victor's face stared back at him, frozen in an expression of terror. His eyes were glassy, his mouth slightly agape. The house fell silent. The dolls had won. The collection was complete, but as the shadows crept through the room, a new voice echoed from the walls. It's never over. Victor's scream still lingered in the air, and somewhere, deep within the house, another child was beginning to disappear. The collection would never stop. Victor is no more. The dolls, now complete, stand in their final formation. Their porcelain faces are flawless, their eyes locked in eternal stillness. But there is one new addition among them, a doll made of human skin. Victor's face, frozen in an expression of terror, stares back at him, his eyes glassy, his mouth slightly agape, forever trapped in the collection. The house falls silent. The curse has been fulfilled, the last piece claimed. But as shadows creep through the room, a new voice echoes from the walls. It's never over. Victor's scream lingers in the air, and somewhere deep within the house another child is beginning to disappear. The collection will never stop.